Moving to Raleigh, North Carolina felt like the culmination of everything my wife and I had worked so hard for. We'd saved for years to afford this house, a gorgeous craftsman-style home with a big backyard. From the moment we stepped onto the porch, it felt like home. My wife, Jade, was already envisioning holiday decorations, and our two kids, Tyler and Zoe, raced around picking their bedrooms. At first, everything went as planned. We met some of the neighbors and settled into our routines. The kids loved the backyard, and I'd even started tackling small projects around the house to make it truly ours. But about a week after we moved in, small things began to happen. Little oddities that didn't seem like a big deal at first, but gradually began to stick out more and more. It started with the knocks. They always came late at night. I started thinking it was a prank, maybe neighborhood kids messing around. I'd go to the door, open it, and find nothing but an empty porch. Jade laughed it off, but after the third or fourth time, even she started to feel uneasy. Then came the notes. They'd appear on the porch, scraps of paper with cryptic, unsettling messages scrawled in jagged handwriting. Things like, "This house remembers," and "You don't belong here." The first time I found one, I crumpled it up and tossed it, thinking it was some kind of weird joke. But they kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. Jade wanted to call the police, but I didn't see the point. What would we say? That someone was leaving creepy notes? The real turning point came one night when Jade woke me up, her voice trembling. "There's someone outside," she whispered. I got out of bed and went to the window. At the edge of our property in the dark stood a woman. She was wearing a long coat. Her loose hair framed her face, covering parts of it. She just stood there watching the house. When I stepped outside and shone my flashlight toward her, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The next day, I called the previous owner. He was a friendly guy in his late 40s. And when we'd met during the sale, he gave me his personal phone number and told me to call him if I needed something. He'd seemed eager to move on, so I asked him if he'd ever experienced anything strange while living in the house. "I was hoping she'd leave you alone," he said. "She?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "My ex-wife," he admitted. She's not well. She's obsessed with that house. Even after the divorce, she refused to accept that it wasn't hers anymore. I'd catch her wandering the property, staring in the windows. It got worse over time. She started leaving notes, messing with the doors, and, well, I'm sorry. I thought she'd move on after I left. I hung up the phone feeling both furious and deeply unsettled. It wasn't just some random stranger messing with us. It was someone with a connection to the house, someone who believed it still belonged to her. After that conversation, Jade and I decided to take precautions. We installed security cameras around the property and added stronger locks to the doors and windows. For a while, things seemed to settle down. The knocks stopped and there were no more notes. But just as things were calming down, the vandalism started. It began with small things, scratches on the front door, plants in the garden uprooted. Then one night, we woke to the sound of shattering glass. A stone had been thrown through the living room window. I rushed outside, but whoever had done it was already gone. In the distance, under the faint glow of the street lamp, I thought I saw a shadow moving away. The next day, we found a note taped to the front door. "Leave, or you'll regret it." Jade was terrified, and for the first time, I started to wonder if we'd made a mistake buying this house. But I couldn't let her win. This was our home now, and I wasn't going to let her scare us out of it. About a week later, things finally crossed the line. It was late, and the kids were asleep. Jade and I were in the kitchen when we heard a loud thud against the front door. I grabbed a baseball bat and opened the door to find another note, pinned to the wood with a knife. "This house doesn't want you," it read. We called the police that night. When they arrived, we showed them the note and the knife and explained everything that had been happening. They promised to patrol the area more often and took the knife for evidence. A few days later, they caught her. She'd been sneaking around in the alley behind our house, watching the windows. When they arrested her, She was still carrying a notebook filled with detailed observations about our family, what times we left the house, when the kids played outside, even what we ate for dinner. Her obsession had gone far beyond anything we could have imagined. Her arrest should have brought us peace, but her parting words have stayed with us. As the officers led her away, she looked over her shoulder and said, "This house is not yours." For months after, those words haunted me. The kids don't seem to notice, but Jade and I haven't slept well since. We keep the security cameras on 24/7 and check every lock twice before going to bed. Some nights, Jade and I sit in the living room, the curtains drawn tight, and talk about moving. But the idea feels like admitting defeat. We've poured so much into this house, our money, our energy, our dreams. Giving it up feels like letting her win. Still, the sense of safety we once felt is gone, replaced by a constant unease. One evening, while sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, I caught myself looking toward the alley. It was empty, of course, but my mind kept warping reality, painting shadows where there were none. Tyler came out to join me, asking if he could play in the backyard. I hesitated before nodding, realizing just how much her actions had affected us. Even something as simple as letting the kids play outside felt fraught with danger. Sometimes when I'm alone in the house, I feel it. A heaviness, a watchfulness that I can't explain. We're trying to move forward, to reclaim the life we dreamed of when we first bought this house. Jade has started planting flowers in the garden again, and I've been working on fixing the damage to the living room window. But some nights, when the wind blows just right, I think I hear a faint knock at the door. The day I first bought the duplex in Syracuse, New York in September 2022, I thought I had made the perfect investment. As a 40-year-old IT technician, I'd spent years saving for a property where I could live comfortably while renting out the second unit to cover expenses. The duplex checked all the boxes: a quiet neighborhood, a reasonable price, and just enough charm to make it feel like home. I moved into the upstairs unit while I worked on prepping the downstairs for renters. It needed a bit of work, some paint, new flooring, and a few plumbing fixes, but nothing I couldn't handle. My days were split between my IT job and working on the downstairs unit. At first, everything seemed fine. The house stayed pretty quiet during the day, and I figured any strange sounds were just part of its old charm. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing things that didn't add up. It started with subtle sounds. At night, while I was upstairs watching TV or reading, I'd hear noises coming from the downstairs unit. A low thump here, a low creak there. Initially, I figured it was just an old house doing old house things, or maybe a critter passing through. It was an older building, after all. The noises started to happen more and more, each one feeling weirder. One night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the downstairs hallway. They weren't loud, but they kept coming, one after another, moving from one end of the unit to the other. I froze, listening intently. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed downstairs as quietly as I could, my hand shaking as I held the handle. The downstairs unit was empty. The doors were locked and the windows were closed. Nothing seemed out of place. I double-checked everything, even the crawlspace access in the utility room, which I hadn't opened since moving in. It was sealed tight. Convinced I was imagining things, I went back upstairs. Over the next week, the noises continued. During the day, the downstairs unit was silent, but at night, it came alive. Footsteps, soft thuds, and from time to time, a faint sound of something dragging across the floor. Each time I checked, I found nothing. It started to mess with my head. I'd lie awake, trying to hear even the smallest sound, my mind running through possibilities. Was it squatters, some kind of animal, or something else entirely? One evening, determined to figure it out, I decided to stay up late and see if I could catch whoever or whatever was behind that chaos. I turned off all the lights and sat by the window overlooking the duplex's front door. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it again, the distinct sound of a chair scraping against the floor. I bolted downstairs and swung the door open. The unit was dark and still. I checked every room, my pulse quickening as I approached the utility room. The crawlspace access panel was slightly ajar. My gut twisted as I bent down to inspect it. It looked like it had been opened recently. Dust and debris littered the floor around it, and faint smudges on the edges suggested it had been used repeatedly. The next morning, I called a friend who worked in construction to help me inspect the crawlspace. Together, we pried open the access panel and shone our flashlights inside. The crawlspace was larger than I expected, running beneath the entire house and connecting the two units. The space smelled damp and earthy, and the low ceiling forced us to crawl on our hands and knees. As we moved farther in, the flashlight lit up something that left me breathless. A makeshift bed, blankets, a pillow, and even a few personal items, a water bottle, an old paperback book, and a half-eaten bag of chips. Someone had been living there. We crawled farther, following the narrow space until we reached a small opening that led up to the closet in the downstairs unit. The access panel had been carefully cut and was hidden behind a row of coats left by the previous owner. It was the perfect hiding spot, completely invisible unless you knew where to look. I was horrified. Whoever had been living there could move freely between the crawl space and the downstairs unit without being detected. Worse, they could have easily accessed my unit if they'd wanted to. The thought of someone silently moving beneath my feet while I slept made my skin crawl. My friend and I sealed the access panel that day, but the eerie feeling didn't go anywhere. That night, I decided to stay in the upstairs unit and keep watch. I locked every door and window and set up a makeshift barricade at the top of the stairs. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time, they were louder. Footsteps, followed by the sound of a door creaking open. I dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was in the house. As I waited for the police to arrive, I heard the footsteps move toward the staircase. I felt the tension in my stomach grow as I braced myself, the silence crushing around me. When the police finally arrived, they searched the downstairs unit and found the crawlspace occupant. He was a man in his late 50s, disheveled and clearly unhinged. He claimed he used to live in the duplex and that it was still his home. "They can't make me leave," he muttered as the officers escorted him out. His eyes darted around the room, wild and unfocused, as if he were searching for something. The police told me he had been squatting in the crawl space for months, possibly even before I bought the property. He'd been sneaking into the downstairs unit at night, careful not to leave too much evidence of his presence. The thought of him living so close, watching me from the shadows, made my stomach churn. I sealed the crawl space the next day, installing a heavy-duty lock and reinforcing the access panel with metal plating. I also replaced the locks on all the doors and added motion sensors around the property. Despite these precautions, the duplex never felt the same. Every small noise, the floors groaning, the wind shaking the windows, kept my nerves frayed. I couldn't stop worrying that he'd somehow return and find a way back in, that he'd been there for so long, quietly observing, and could return just as easily. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, straining to hear anything unusual, my body tense with anticipation. If there's one lesson I've learned from this, it's to never ignore strange noises or signs of something unusual in your house. What sounds like an innocent noise could easily be something far more disturbing. Months later, it still gives me the creeps just thinking about it. The duplex was supposed to be a fresh start, a smart investment. Instead, it showed me how fragile our sense of safety can be, even in our own homes. I've started looking for a new place, somewhere far away from Syracuse. Until then, I double-check every lock, every window, and every corner of the house before I go to bed. What haunts me the most is the realization of how long he might have been there. How many nights had I slept peacefully while he moved silently below me? How many times had I been completely unaware of his presence? The duplex was supposed to be a new chapter, but instead, it became a story I'll never forget. And no matter where I go, I'll always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's managed to find another crawl space to call home. In July 2022, I moved into a cozy little bungalow in Tampa, Florida. It was the kind of house I'd always imagined for myself. Beautiful, with white shutters, a small garden, and just enough space for me to feel at home. As a teacher, I wanted a place to unwind after long days in the classroom. This house seemed perfect. Everything about it, from the tree-lined street to the inviting porch, felt like the start of a new chapter. The first few weeks were blissful. I spent my evenings arranging furniture, hanging photos, and sipping iced tea on the porch while the sunset painted the sky. I'd always dreamed of having a place like this, somewhere that felt completely mine. But just as I was settling in, something strange happened. One evening, while grading papers on the couch, the light in the living room flickered. It wasn't constant, just a quick dimming and then back to normal. I barely noticed it at first, thinking it was just an old bulb or a momentary power surge. After all, the house was built in the 1950s. A little quirkiness was expected. But the flickering didn't stop. Over the next few days, it became more frequent. I replaced the bulb in the living room, assuming that would solve the problem, but it didn't. Then the flickering started in the hallway, then the kitchen. It seemed to move from room to room, almost as if it had a pattern. I thought it was probably just the old wiring, but the sequence felt too deliberate to ignore. At first, I tried to laugh it off, joking to myself that maybe the house had a personality. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the flickering began, it was harder to dismiss. It didn't feel random. It felt intentional. The lights would dim and brighten in a specific order: hallway, kitchen, living room. Always the same, always late at night. One night, as I was preparing for bed, the lights flickered just as I passed the attic door in the hallway. My eyes darted upward, and for a moment I thought I saw the faintest shift of shadow beneath the attic hatch. I stood there, staring at the ceiling, but everything was still. Shaking my head, I told myself it was just my imagination. By the second week, I'd had enough. I called an electrician to inspect the wiring. The man who arrived was kind and professional, spending nearly 2 hours checking every circuit, outlet, and the breaker box. He even climbed into the attic to ensure there were no damaged cables or rodents causing issues. When he came back down, he looked perplexed. "Everything's fine," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "No loose wires, no faulty connections. Honestly, your system is in great shape. I'm not sure what could be causing the flickering." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks for checking." His words didn't help. If the wiring was fine, what was causing the lights to act up? That night, the lights flickered again, following their strange, deliberate pattern. This time, I sat on the couch, watching as each room dimmed in sequence, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But it felt like the house was trying to tell me something. Over the next week, the flickering became more frequent, and the pattern shifted. Instead of moving room to room, the lights seemed to guide my attention to specific areas. The hallway closet, the corner of the living room, the attic door. It was as if the house was directing me, urging me to look closer. One evening, as I was cleaning the kitchen, the light above me flickered 3 times in rapid succession. I looked toward the hallway, where the attic door loomed. My heart sank. I hadn't touched that door since moving in. The idea of climbing into a dark, dusty attic filled me with dread, but the flickering lights seemed insistent. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just tired. But as the days went on, the house's atmosphere grew heavier. It didn't feel like a cozy haven anymore. It felt like something was watching me. One night, after a particularly long day, I was reading in bed when the bedroom light began to flicker. This time, it didn't stop. The flickering grew faster, more erratic, until the bulb finally went out, leaving me in total darkness. I grabbed my phone, its screen casting a dim glow, and decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to check the attic. The attic door was located in the hallway ceiling, accessible by a pull-down ladder. I'd avoided it since moving in, but now I felt like I didn't have a choice. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and unfolded the ladder, its hinges creaking loudly in the quiet house. The wooden steps felt unsteady beneath my weight as I climbed. When I reached the top, I shone the flashlight into the attic, illuminating a space filled with cobwebs, insulation, and forgotten boxes. Then I saw a single, bare bulb hanging from the center of the attic. It flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows that danced on the walls. I reached out, my fingers trembling, but before I could touch it, the bulb flashed violently and went out, plunging the attic into pitch blackness. The silence that followed was deafening. Then I heard a soft sound, almost like fabric brushing against wood. The noise came from the far corner of the attic. I swung the flashlight in that direction, but the light only revealed more shadows. "Hello?" I whispered. There was no response. Panic hit me, but I managed to move back toward the ladder, gripping the flashlight with every ounce of strength I had. I didn't wait to see what was making the noise. I climbed down as fast as I could, nearly tripping in my haste. Once I was back in the hallway, I slammed the attic door shut and locked it, even though I knew it wouldn't do much good. That night, I sat on the couch with all the lights on, flinching at every little noise the house made. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I called a couple of friends to help me pack up my essentials. When they arrived, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded flat, even to me. I left out the part about the bulb and the rustling. It sounded too unbelievable. They helped me gather my belongings, and I left the house that afternoon, handing the keys back to the landlord without looking back. To this day, I still don't know what caused the lights to flicker or what was waiting for me in the attic. I've told myself it was just an electrical issue, but deep down, I'm not convinced. Whatever it was, it didn't want me there. And I'm more than happy to stay away. The memory of that house still lingers, though. Every time I pass by an old home or see a flickering light, I'm reminded of that night. When we moved into the old house in Columbus, Ohio, it felt like a dream come true. My wife, Camila, and I had finally found a place big enough for our family. A charming older home with plenty of space for our two kids, Liam and Sophie, to run around. I loved the idea of settling down in a place with a yard where the kids could play. The house was a little dated with old-fashioned wallpaper, but that was part of its charm. We spent the first few days getting everything organized. Liam and Sophie were thrilled with their new rooms, and they wasted no time exploring the backyard. It felt perfect. It started about a week after we moved in. One afternoon, Sophie came running into the kitchen, clutching a piece of paper. "Daddy, look, I drew the man in the backyard," she said excitedly. I looked at the drawing and smiled. It was a typical kid sketch: stick figures, a house, and a tall figure standing by the fence. "Is this your imaginary friend?" I teased. "No," Sophie said, shaking her head. "He's real. Liam saw him too." Liam, who was sitting at the kitchen table coloring, chimed in. "Yeah, he was standing by the tree. He watches us when we play." I laughed it off, assuming it was just a game they were playing. Kids have wild imaginations. But over the next few days, they kept drawing him. Every picture featured the same figure, a tall man with a hat, always standing in the same spot in the backyard. It was odd, but I didn't think much of it. One rainy Saturday, I decided to tackle the attic. It was one of those spaces we'd been avoiding, dusty, cluttered, and full of forgotten junk. Armed with a flashlight and a broom, I climbed the creaky ladder and started sorting through the boxes and old furniture. As I was moving an old trunk, I noticed something tucked behind it, a stack of yellowed papers held together with a brittle rubber band. Curious, I picked them up and began to flip through them. They were drawings, children's drawings, and every single one of them featured the same figure, a tall man in a hat standing in the backyard. I felt sick. The drawings looked old, like they had been there for decades. The paper was brittle, the edges frayed, but the resemblance to Liam and Sophie's sketches was uncanny. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. I brought the drawings downstairs and showed them to Camila. "Look at this," I said, spreading them out on the dining table. These were in the attic. They're just like the ones Liam and Sophie have been making. Camila frowned as she studied the pictures. That's weird, she said. Maybe it's a coincidence? But it didn't feel like a coincidence. There were too many similarities. The figure, the backyard, even the style of the drawings. It was all too much to ignore. The next day, I decided to call the real estate agent and ask about the previous owners. She gave me the contact information for the man who had sold the house, a guy named Robert. He was friendly when I called, but his tone changed when I mentioned the drawings. Those drawings, I said. Did your kids ever draw something like that? A man in the backyard? There was a long pause. Those were mine, Robert said. I drew those when I was a kid. My heart sank. What do you mean? Why did you draw them? I started seeing him not long after we moved in, Robert explained. At first, it was just during the day. I'd see him standing by the fence watching. My parents thought I was making it up, but then I started having nightmares. He'd be inside the house, standing at the foot of my bed. Did your parents ever figure out who he was? I asked, feeling my legs weak. My dad did some digging, Robert said. He found out that the man who built the house died just a few days after it was finished. He was working on the backyard when it happened. They said he had a heart attack, but I don't know. My dad thought maybe he never left. When night fell, I couldn't stop thinking about what Robert had said. The kids were asleep and Camila was reading in bed, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see someone standing in the yard. Around midnight, I heard a light tapping noise. It was coming from the window in the living room. My pulse quickened as I walked over to investigate, but when I pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there. Just the backyard, dark and empty. The next morning, Liam came to the breakfast table with another drawing. This one was different. The man wasn't in the backyard anymore. He was inside the house. Liam, why did you draw him in the living room? I asked, doing my best to keep my voice from shaking. Because that's where he was last night, Liam said simply. He was looking at the pictures on the wall. Camila and I looked at each other, the worry in our eyes unmistakable. It's just a dream, she said quickly. Kids have vivid imaginations. But I wasn't so sure. The tapping, the drawings, Robert's story, it was all adding up to something I didn't want to admit. Over the next few days, the heaviness in the house became impossible to ignore. The kids started complaining about bad dreams, and Camila said she felt like someone was watching her when she was alone. Even I started to feel like there were eyes on me. Every time I walked past a window, I expected to see the man standing there, staring back at me. Finally, I decided we needed to do something. I contacted my elderly neighbors to learn more about the house's history. They confirmed what Robert had said. The original owner, a man named Charles Moore, had died in the backyard shortly after completing the house, and there were no reports of foul play. One evening, as we were picking up the leftover boxes the old owners had abandoned to throw them away, Sophie handed me one last drawing. It showed the man, but this time he wasn't alone. He was standing next to a boy who looked just like Liam. That moment cemented our decision to act quickly. I spoke with the real estate agent and Robert the next morning, explaining everything that had been happening. To my relief, they both agreed to cancel the sale. Robert even expressed a strange sense of responsibility, accepting the house back without hesitation. As unsettling as the entire experience was, walking away from that house felt like shedding a heavy weight. He said goodbye, Sophie whispered. I didn't know what to say. We moved out a week later, leaving the house and its mysteries behind. But even now, I can't help but wonder, was it just the imagination of two creative kids? Or was there something in that house, something watching us, waiting for us to notice? All I know is this: sometimes the past lingers longer than we think. And sometimes it watches us from the shadows, waiting to be seen. If these stories gave you goosebumps, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you're always ready for our next spine-chilling upload. Don't keep the chills all to yourself. Share this video and give your friends a reason to sleep with the lights on. Have your own creepy moving in experience? Email me. I'd love to feature your story. Stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and remember, not every housewarming is a warm welcome. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.